Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to have that we have Kai Heron, Keir Milburn, and Bertie Russell with us today, and they're going to talk about their new book, Radical Abundance: How to Win a Green Democratic Future. Really quickly, the slides are shown with the notes right now, not
Okay.
in full screen presentation. Um, But yeah, I'm just going to read the description of the event. So, capitalism has created a world of bullshit abundance where we have too much of what we don't need and too little of what we do. Through this system's relentless pursuits of profit, we have been put on a collision course with social and ecological limits that can no longer be ignored. We need an alternative. We need radical abundance. A world of human and non-human flourishing made possible by democratically planned production. But radical abundance can't just be voted into existence through parliamentary means. It must be made by taking control of our collective reproduction in the here and now. Radical Abundance: How to Win a Green Democratic Future examines what a transition to world of democratical of radical abundance looks like and lays out a concrete strategy for achieving it. Join the authors Kai Heron, Milburn, and Bertie Russell as they discuss the book and their attempts to build democratic economic planning from below. Take a shot every time radical abundance is mentioned. Um, and here is the link to the book. And they're also part of an organization called Abundance, and you can also find their link in the chat right now. So take it away.
Thanks, Eric. Yes, so you can see my slides now, I take it. It's all fine. Perfect. Yeah, thanks for that introduction. Yes, the three of us are here today. We're going to talk about this book, Radical Abundance: How to Win a Green Democratic Future. Of course, when you do a book launch, you don't cover all of the arguments in a book. You try to tailor it to the audience. So we're going to try to tailor it towards an audience that we think would probably be interested in democratic economic planning. And then we can get into any bits that we don't that we skip over in the Q&A if that's what you if you want. I'm going to just start off, and I'll start off with this actually. That this is a book by three authors, which is unusual, I think. Unusual as well because I think it presents a fairly coherent argument overall, rather than three different conflicting arguments. I mean, part of the reason we could do that is because we've known each other for a long time. We've been political comrades and friends for quite a while, and we've worked together for a while. So I'll explain, how we came together, really, how we came together and to write this book, because that provides some of the context of what we're trying to do with the book. I think we can put it that way. Why does the book look the way it does? Not necessarily the cover, which might be the only thing you've seen so far, but the structure of the book, which you might get into in a little bit. In fact, I'll start with the structure of the book. Is in broad terms, it's split into two halves, something like that. The first half introduces what we think is wrong with the world in some sort of way, and then presents a theory of transition for how we get out of that world, etc. Halfway through the book, we introduce this idea of public common partnerships, which is up here in the title. And we say what that means. And then in the latter half, the last three chapters, well, there's a conclusion. So three chapters that follow that before the conclusion, then go through how we might get to radical abundance by using public common partnerships in three different sectors. So economic, urban development, pharmaceutical production, and food systems. Those aren't the only things we think it could be applied to, but those are the things we've actually done work on. We've tried to really practically think that through on the ground. So I'll start with this term public common partnerships, which I first started to think about and work on. I think it was in late 2017. And the story goes a little bit like this, is that I'd seen my good friend Bertie Russell use this term public common partnerships. I thought, God, that sounds really interesting. I wonder what that means. What should I read about that? I wrote to Bert, said, what should I read about this, Bert? It sounds interesting. He said, well, to be honest, there's nothing really written about it. It's a bit of an empty term. Why don't we fill it in? And so we started to work on it together and sort of like try to think through what it could mean, but what it could mean in the abstract, really. Um, we started discussing it. We started meeting and walking around the hills of Hebden Bridge and sort of like try to think through this concept. And then we wrote a couple of articles. In fact, today we were just remembering, we were having a little chat. We were just remembering the first article that me and Bert wrote, um, which was an intervention into an argument, into a discussion that was going on in the UK called the institutional turn, and it was around the time of Corbynism, where Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and people were thinking about institutions, not how you build new institutions, particularly around democratic planning, alternative models of ownership, these sorts of things. And the first article we made an argument which I'd sort of forgotten about, that institutions can play a key compositional role. They can be a tool for political composition, and that's something perhaps we'll come back to later on. So we wrote a couple of articles, then we wrote a report for the think tank Commonwealth. That was actually Commonwealth's first report that they published, where we thought through this concept of public common partnerships in the abstract. And then people persuaded us that we should try to put it into practice. And so we got introduced to a couple of projects, one of which we'll talk about a bit later, the Ward's Corner Latin Village Market in Tottenham in North London, and another one which was a project in Plymouth in the south of England, um, which was to try to bring a whole street into common ownership. We moved away from that project in the end, but it's a very, very interesting project. When we thought, right, we're going to have to do some sort of engagement with these projects and try to think through how they could be turned into public common partnerships. And so we thought we better turn to our old friend and comrade Kai Heron to help with that, which is why Kai joined the project. And then after we produced another report for Commonwealth, and after that we started to get asked, people to start to read those reports and say, why don't you come and have a look at what we're doing? Could this be a public common partnership? Started to get asked into projects like urban development projects, a project in France around commonly owned and governed pharmaceutical production, etc., etc. And at that point, we decided that we basically needed a just get this sorted. We needed to form some sort of organization. So as Eric said, we formed an organization we started to form it around 2023, an organization called Abundance, not linked to the Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson conception of abundance, but we'll talk about that later. I think we were first. So Abundance is like a very small organization. There's 5 co-directors, a network of people around that we work with, etc. All 3 of us are co-directors of Abundance. So it's like a think tank, but we're trying to set up these projects. We're trying to fulfill this strategy. We've got a strategy. We're going to try and fulfill it by setting up practical examples of public common partnerships. If you go to this is the picture. This is the welcome page from the website. And if you go there, you can sign up to our mailing list. It's quite infrequent, but perhaps it will become more frequent. Yeah, so basically, we started to do this work. We started to set up an organization, and at this point, we decided that we needed to move from this concrete work back up to the abstract again. We started off with the abstract, moved down to the concrete, and went up to the abstract again. Decided that we needed to elaborate the concept. Well, people talk about a theory of change, don't they? But we don't think it is a theory of change. We think it's a theory of transition, basically. And that is basically what the book is. It presents a theory of transition, a theory of strategy of transition, we'll put it that way. And so that's why we wrote the book. It's a sort of internal logic, a logic internal to our own work and our own organizational development of why we would write a book about transition at this point. We also think there are conjunctural reasons why we felt the need to write a book about transition, because we think that transition is the problem of our time. Basically, it's the problem. It's basically the structuring problem of politics and economics. We probably put it that way. The need for transition, we argue in the book, arises out of 2 huge determining crises. There's a lot of we're faced with quite a lot of crises. I think you'll agree. In the book, we make an argument that there are 2 ones which determine the others. We could probably alter that a little bit, but I think it stands up for the time being. The 2 crises, one of which won't be a surprise to anyone, is the ecological deterioration, etc., the accelerating ecological deterioration that you see, not just with climate change, but with species extinction, all of these sorts of things. And the other crisis we would say is long-term or secular economic stagnation. And the way that that affects us, like the key way in which that affects things is that it means that current economic growth models cannot produce rising living standards for a wide enough section of the population to maintain economic, political, and social stability, basically, which is why you see this incredible political volatility, the election of Donald Trump as we speak, the election of a socialist as a mayor of New York, etc. Just incredibly politically volatile times. Um, these two crises, ecological deterioration, economic stagnation, they obviously compound each other. One of the ways in which we experience ecological deterioration is by an increase in the cost of living, basically. You know, the cost of olives goes up because there's a drought. You know, all of these sorts of accelerating, pulsing crises, etc., just push prices up, make everything cost more. That's not something that's going to go away. That's something that's a secular long-term trend from now on. But also, you would also say that perhaps the solution to these two crises seem to pull apart from each other, because well, definitionally, um, the solution to economic stagnation is to increase growth. But we would say this under conditions of ecological deterioration and also under the current setup of capitalism, in which you have really quite a dominance by rentier business models, these sorts of things. Under those sorts of conditions, you know, growth, you know, the question of growth is not so simple, we put it that way, which is where we could bring Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's book Abundance in at this point. You know, we start to, I think we'd submitted our book, a draft of our book to the publisher. Then we hear tell of this other book, Abundance, and we thought, oh, well, we have to revise the book. When we went to revise the book, we realized actually all of the stuff we needed to critique Klein and Thompson already in the book. I won't go into I won't go into our specific critiques of Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. But you know, their argument is just we need growth. We need growth almost by any means necessary, but their means primarily are regulatory de-risking, removal of regulation, etc., etc. You know, in response to that, we would say, look, under current conditions, if you want growth, you have to answer this question: growth of what, produced under what imperatives, and therefore benefiting who, and who bears the costs of that, right? If you want abundance, well, abundance of what, produced by what imperatives, who's going to benefit from that abundance is not necessarily, in fact, it's very unlikely to be everybody. And who bears the costs of that, and what are the costs, what are the ecological costs, etc., etc., etc. The way we get into that in the book is introducing this distinction between what we call bullshit abundance, a very nice coinage, even if I do say so myself, and radical abundance. Bullshit abundance, I mean, I won't get into that now. It's one of those bits that we could get into in the question if you want. We'll move past it a little bit. But like basically, bullshit abundance always goes along with artificial scarcity. And so we make this argument that what we experience is a bullshit abundance of stuff we don't need and a scarcity of the stuff we do need. You know, the reason behind that is what gets invested in capitalism, is what makes or what promises to make the biggest comparative profit. And that does not necessarily line up to your needs. And we'd say in the current iteration of capitalism, it's less and less likely to line up with need, basically. There's lots of ways we could get into that, but I'm going to skip that for now. We'll get back. I'm going to skip examples and we'll get back to that if you want to get into that later on. You know, if we're not going to make investment decisions based on the promise of comparative highest profitability, well, what is that? What are we going to make? How are we going to make decisions? Which is where we get into democratic planning. And so for us, you know, we make the argument that you need democratic control of what gets produced, most importantly, what gets invested in. And that gives you the preconditions for radical abundance. It's not the same as radical abundance. Democratic planning, addressing our needs, is not the same as radical abundance, but it gives the precondition to radical abundance. We think radical abundance is the excess that you get when the realm of necessity is addressed to some degree. So I'm going to skip over that a little bit. Here we have Comrade Brezhnev. I think he's phoning up about the baseball scores, or perhaps he's ordering 10% increase in the production of underpants. I'm not sure. But this is what we're going to talk about. We're not going to focus on bullshit abundance, radical abundance. We're going to focus on transition. In a moment, Kai is going to talk about our theory of transition, the more theoretical, the resources that we draw on, etc. Then Bertie's going to talk about public common partnership as a transitional institution. So not necessarily a model for a post-capitalist society, but a transitional institution that helps us get there. And then I'll come back at the end and talk about one of the examples of what we've tried to put it into practice, the Ward's Corner Latin Village Market in Tottenham. So I'll hand over to Kai.
Thank you, Keir. Yeah, next slide. Thank you. So yeah, as Keir's already said, oh, I should start. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It means a lot. It's exciting to have this conversation, and especially to have the encouragement to think, about the way it contributes to economic planning discussions. Yeah, it's valuable. So yeah, the first half of the book, Keir's already done me the service of explaining. It talks about transition and tries to theorize transition. And we do this through a series of steps. So there's a chapter that thinks about transition in a kind of more abstract way, theorizing what we call the invariant features of transition. Then we do two kinds of conjunctural analyses. So we try and make that abstract theorization more concrete. The first of those more concretizations thinks about social movements and kind of a conjunctural analysis from below of how social movements have shifted after the 2008 financial crash. And then the second of those conjunctural chapters thinks from above, and it tries to think about logics of de-risking and those two crisis tendencies that Keir's just spoken about, like what Christian Parenti calls the catastrophic convergence of ecological crises and economic crises, and how they mutually amplify one another. I'm not going to talk about those two chapters too much. They'll come in, I hope, in the Q&A if you're interested. So I'm going to focus my time on that first chapter on theories of transition. And I'm going to explain the kind of context in which we try and make that argument. So Keir's already said, right, transition, as we would put it, is the problem of our time. So there's green transitions, though we know that's not really happening. We're just adding renewable energy into fossil fuel energy. There are geopolitical transitions, that transitions towards a kind of Overton window further towards the right. This term seems to be everywhere. The place where it isn't as much, we argue, is in kind of left discussion and theorization. So Keir, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. This is kind of how we think about this. So there's some language here that we borrow from Istvan Messeros, who wrote a book called Beyond Capital, subtitled Towards a Theory of Transition. It came out in 1995, and it really was one of our touchstones when we were trying to think about transition and how to reignite discussion around transition. But on the left-hand side of this slide, we have this idea that we are firmly in this pink circle, right, which we call capital's social metabolism, the language that Messeros uses. We are reproduced day to day as workers by capitalism, no surprise. What we need to do is ecologically and socially necessary is jump over to the right-hand side rather, where we have democratically mediated communal social metabolisms. The problem is that gap, right? So what we're calling there the horizon of political possibility. We kind of struggle to imagine how to move over from what we think is conceivable now into this future post-capitalist society. So next slide. Thanks, Keir. And so there's a few ways that people have sort of tried to think about this, and we have this slightly tongue-in-cheek image of this. So people a kind of long jump, if you like, over this problem of transition, right, from capitalism to a post-capitalist communist society. And there are some concepts that try to do this. So things like communization theory, the general strike, the idea of seizing the state, the classic kind of Leninist solution, various policy options, maybe the commons or co-ops. But in our book, we argue for various reasons, these don't quite take the problem of transition seriously enough. So just to pick one, yeah, Messeros's point about seizing the state, he's like, yes, it's great. Seizing the state, if possible, helps. But the question of transition then becomes even more important because you have control of the state, but you're still functioning under capital's metabolic control, as he puts it. We're still being governed by capital's laws of value. We need to dismantle those and put in place a more communal form of organization, of planning, and of our collective reproduction. So you might seize the state, but that just makes transition more of an urgent problem, right? Or we might expand spaces of, say, common ownership or of co-ops. But those co-ops then, how do they link up and actually lead to a transition in which we oust, as a language I'm going to use later, we oust capital from our collective reproduction and have a kind of communal and communistic form of reproduction instead. So we don't find these concepts totally convincing. The next slide, thank you. Thanks, Kit. So it's another kind of set of debates and conversations that we were thinking about when we were writing this chapter. After about 2015, 2016, there began to be, and I'm using abundance just because it's the word of the day, right? But there began to be this kind of abundance of books thinking about a post-capitalist future or an envisioning post-capitalist futures. Many of these have been hugely inspiring for us. Not all of the books on this page, but many of them. And so we find these useful and as guides, but they don't do the work of thinking, how do we go from where we are to where we need to be? Or if they mention it, it's very vague. So things like, well, we build social movements, we do an electoral strategy, we combine those things together, and then transition happens, right? Which there's just a very, very thin notion of transition. So what we wanted to do is say, as great as all of these are, we need to actually go headlong into the problem of transition itself. There's one book I want to pick on in particular here that was very influential to us as well, which is Pat Devine's Democracy and Economic Planning, which thinks in a deep way about democratic planning and organization. But again, it doesn't solve this problem of how do you go there, right? It talks about what it should look like as an end goal, but the question of how we get to his desired end goal is missing. And we think if you don't connect transition to where you end up, then there's no pathway, right? Yeah. So next slide. Wait, did we skip over one? I think we may have done. Yeah, thank you. So this is another kind of carrying forward this idea of the circles, right? We need a way of thinking about transition that takes us from where we are to where we need to be. So unfortunately in this, from the left to the right, but from the right to the left is the goal. Okay, bring me back to where I was. Thanks. And our point is that it needs to be politically useful, and it needs to pay attention to something else that I think is often overlooked in some of the more traditional theorizations of transition from previous cycles of discussion about this, which is that transition isn't linear. We don't move in a teleological way from a capitalist society into a post-capitalist society. There is no guarantee once you set foot in that direction that you will end up in a communist society. Things can always fall back. They are reversible. They're contingent, right? So we wanted a theory of transition that could capture this idea that we could move back and forth, and that there will be these complexly overlapping spaces in the middle of the transition towards a communist future where capitalism and communism kind of interrelate and interpenetrate. So these are kind of the parameters in which we're going to try and theorize. Now the next slide. Okay, so what we do in this chapter, we introduce Istvan Mesouras, and we talk about the need to think about capital not just as an economy, but as a metabolism between human reproduction and non-human nature. And then we say that all transitions, no matter if they're successful, even if they're only temporarily successful, manifest two invariant features. Number one, and it should be number two, but number one, contested reproduction, and number two, popular protagonism. And then we offer public common partnerships as a kind of strategic wager that does both of these things. It has both contested reproduction and popular protagonism. You could think about other institutional forms that do this. That's kind of not our focus in the book, but I just raised, we're not saying it's the only institution. That would be like an incredibly audacious claim, and that's not our point, but that it is one institution that might be relevant for this moment that manifests contested reproduction and popular protagonism. And so I'm going to explain those two concepts, starting with popular protagonism, actually. So next slide. Starting with popular protagonism. All right. So point of reference here, the popular protagonism term is catching on in an interesting way in UK conversations at the moment, but we tend to hear it more as popular power. But we wanted to retain the notion of popular protagonism as a nod towards our influence for this, which is Martha Harnecker. So Harnecker thought very concretely on the ground about how to bring about planning from below, as she called it, thinking in Kerala, thinking in Venezuela, and elsewhere in Latin America. And she says, well, if you're going to have democratic planning from below, you need this thing called popular protagonism. Popular because it's exercised by the working classes in the broadest sense, wage and unwage workers, peasants in the context that Harnack is thinking in, and protagonism because the idea is that through collective action and organization, those classes become, if you like, the main characters of a social transformation. And so she says the way to think about popular protagonism, the important determining instance of if we are in a transitionary period in which popular protagonism is being exercised, is if that transition is organized by the popular classes themselves rather than by some kind of elite or bureaucratic class acting on their behalf. So it can't be the bourgeois state, it can't be a bourgeois political party, it can't be a group that is separated from the democratic plans of the working classes as a whole. The key move that we pick up on and try and push a bit further, it's implicit in Harnecker's work, but we really wanted to press this, and Keir's mentioned this as well as already, is that popular protagonism can't be exercised without institutions. So you need an institutional container that allows workers to compose and cohere collective and shared common interests. So we don't presume, unlike some Marxists who I'll keep nameless, that there's like an objective shared interest that all workers have prior to organizing and fighting together. Instead, we recognize that you need institutions that foster, generate, and the language we use is compose shared interests. And just to show that there's precedents for thinking in these ways, Marx, 1852, he has this interesting line where he says that the working classes in Europe will have to go 15, 20, 50 years through civil wars and national struggles, not just to change society, but to change themselves so that they are capable of governing, right? We don't have those 50 years. There's a problem posed in this quote for us. But the point stands, right, that we have to transform ourselves through our action. And that's what we mean by popular protagonism. Okay, next slide. Contested reproduction, so the other invariant feature. And again, we try and take our concepts where possible from revolutionary thinkers and actors. And so we get the idea of contested reproduction from Evgeny Preobrazhensky, but via Michael Lebovitz, who thought quite closely about this notion as well. So Preobrazhensky, writing after the 1917 Russian Revolution, he basically encounters the problem I just described about what happens if you seize the state. Yes, they're in command of the state, but Russian economy is organized in such a way that capitalism is the dominant force. And so now they need to think about transition. And he says that if a transition is going to happen, there are going to be two competing economic logics occurring side by side. They won't, and more than that, they won't just coexist, but they'll interpenetrate one another in a complex way. And by interpenetrating one another, they deform one another and influence one another. And this becomes the kind of problem space of transition. So he says the task is to oust, in his language, capital's laws of motion, its habits of thought and divisions of labor from our reproduction, and replace it with socialist principles and practices. This process is always, again, reversible. It can go forward towards socialism and it can fall back towards a capitalist society. And so, as Lebovitz puts it, the central question for revolutionaries is how to create the conditions in which elements of capitalism can be subordinated to the system of community. And community is simply his language for communism. And so this concept, this idea of how to subordinate capital is the thing that we'll pick up on when we talk about PCPs. It's one of their primary functions. It is their primary function, I would say. And then just again to show there is a precedent for thinking in this kind of way in the Marxist traditions, Lenin has a really interesting line when he was analyzing the countryside in Russia in 1899, where he says, life creates forms that unite in themselves with remarkable gradualness, systems of economy whose, I'm trying to read a quote, whose basic features constitute opposites. It becomes impossible to say where labor service ends and where capitalism begins. The point being, it becomes impossible to say where the new economic models or socialist transition might happen. So labor service is the feudal systems of control, and capitalism begins. Feudalism and capitalism interpenetrate to such an extent that it's hard to tease them apart. Precisely the same thing will happen in a transition out of capitalism as we have this space of contested reproduction. So we borrow from Preobrazhensky, but one of the clear differences is we're not living in a world where a communist state exists, right? And so we make this kind of conceptual wager, the strategic wager, that contested reproduction isn't something that needs to wait until after you've seized the state. In fact, even in the case of Russia with the Soviet Union and the Soviets, contested reproduction can kind of begin before the revolutionary rupture. And in fact, any kind of rupture, if there were to be one, would need contested reproduction to have been in place before to support and foster it as it drives it forward. Okay, so that's the kind of conceptual basis of our work. And then I will stop talking, and then I think Bert's going to explain what public common partnerships are and how they function.
Yeah, thank you. You get three of us saying thank you for attending, and we're really excited to be here as well. And it is genuine, even if I'm the third person saying it. So yeah, just to reiterate that. So yeah, to pick up on one thing was the ambition of the book, or kind of at one point it almost seemed overly ambitious, was here. You've got it with all of the notes showing. If you could change it so it's just that. So the ambition of the book was both to, on the one hand, do what Kai had set out, which arguably would have been the kind of content, or could have been a book in itself, which was thinking, how do we think about transition? How do we document the kind of shortcomings so far, and how do we think about it? And then there was a sort of second part to this book, which was intended to be about what do you do about this? Like how do you actually on the ground start to organize, and how do we actually put some of these principles into practice? So it was quite ambitious to do two of these things, but we gave it our best shot, I suppose you can say. So if I'm going to try and summarize, just kind of launch us into this bit, summarize kind of how I understand Kai's take on this, which is we're pretty clear that where we're trying to get to is a scenario where we do have coherent planning systems. This is something which pretty much most of the people that we're working with, the people who've really emphasized us and where they've drawn from, Marta Hanneke, for example, drawing from Keir, is very significant, because that is an area where there's been quite advanced forms of democratic economic planning in the way that they function. So we're quite clear in the sense that we need to reach this kind of future society where we can simply say this is one which is kind of conditioned by, or it's clearly governed through these democratic systems of economic planning. That's, for us, is not contentious. The big problem is that much of this work on democratic economic planning and much contemporary political theory and practice, as Kai outlined, has separated the future off from the present. So it either jumps over this question of how you move from the present to the future, or it denies that the problem is there whatsoever. And so we're left with this question of, well, how do we liberate ourselves from capital social control? And in the process constitute alternative communal mechanisms of control in its place. And this starts to get into this kind of motion that Kai is talking about, this replacement process that's taking place. And so we have these two invariant features of transition: contested reproduction on the one hand, and popular protagonism on the other hand. And quite often these things, and you'll kind of become clear as we expand on this, they don't exist as things which can be completely separated from one another. They're sort of embedded within institutions, they build upon one another. Now, the big challenge is this remains still strictly at a conceptual level, and this is all in like front half of the book, if you will. The question is, how do you actually start to put any of this into practice? And we have drawn, and we point towards sort of briefly within the book, lots of places where we can see some of these two invariant features actually in practice. So if you're looking at some of the forms of communitarian public economic planning that are taking place in the Basque Country, or if you look to Kerala, Mississippi, the struggles over the housing socialization in Berlin within this, the communal systems and their relationship and tensions with the state in Venezuela. So we're taking inspirations from really quite distinct contexts. They're distinct in terms of the composition, class composition. They're distinct in terms of where they are within global value chains. They're distinct in terms of the legal concepts that they're operating in, the economic, and so on. They're very, very different circumstances. But what we can see across all of these is that these two invariant features are in motion, which is exciting. In some ways, we start to use this language of there being something which resembles a political tendency here. Not that it's fully formed or that everybody sees themselves in that way, but we know, and we are part of these literally a part of these conversations across these different these geographies about how these movements build off one another. But it's important to bring us right back down to where the three of us are all from, which is from the UK, and I'm based in Barcelona, so sort of have some more of an awareness of the context here as well. And to say, fantastic, you might draw inspiration from Kerala, or you may draw inspiration from Venezuela, but does that really translate into knowing what your political practice would be being sat in here in Barcelona? You know, is our intention to find somebody who has served a certain number of years in the military and hope that they're going to be a revolutionary leader? And is this the way we're thinking that things need to move forward from here? And our starting point is to say, well, you know, maybe, but that's like that's not our kind of go-to right now. And what we're trying to do is come up with wages. How do we take these concepts of transition? How do we translate them into what we're adamant as institutional forms in ways that make sense within quite radically different geographies, radically different conjunctures, which is the kind of part of the book that we build out on. We're not going to now go into all of this kind of conjunctural analysis for various different reasons of the depth, but it's important to situate. When we say that we think public partnerships are a wager, we don't mean they're a wager in terms of like a form of political action that could happen anywhere in the world right now, or in any particular time period. We're not suggesting these have this universal quality. We're imagining that these really are something which are doable, actionable. They have content. If you're in Leeds, for example, or if you're in Glasgow, I've paid attention to where some of the people are saying that they're from. If you're from Manchester, for example, so we're starting from understanding this from the context within parts of the UK, but we also have drawn inspiration from other places where we know things like this have already worked and we think they can have purchase. I've already mentioned the Basque Country. We've drawn from Barcelona. We're drawing from Germany. We've got elements of this where we've done our own work in France. So we can sort of talk about the potential viability of these being a political wager that could be made. Perhaps we might say within the sort of liberal democratic imperial core countries, although it's not up for us, as the three of us as authors of this book, it's not up for us to decide that this is the appropriate wager everywhere. It's where we think it might have some sort of viability, let's say, where we'd encourage other people to kind of challenge that or take it forward. So what is a public common partnership? It's this wager which is attempting to kind of bring these two different elements, these two different parts of contested reproduction and popular protagonism, and put them into an institutional form. Here, could you skip to the next slide? Thanks. So in brief, public common partnerships are, this is what I'm presenting now is, let's say, at its most abstract level. I'm not giving examples drawn from any of our particular work. This is if you were to take a, you know, kind of the shadow protected onto Plato's wall. I think this is completely abstracted from real context in this way. It's an institutional form that looks to democratize the management and the ownership of an asset or a resource, or a productive company. And so this can be really applying to we're not suggesting this applies to anything, but we do think it can be applying to a very broad range of different assets. So you could be talking about farm or woodland or an energy company or all of the buildings on a high street or a last mile logistics firm or grocery chains or hotels or a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant. So we think there are many ways where this could have some purchase, where it has some logic in terms of where it works. And at its core, the public common partnership, and the emphasis on the word here is the partnership, it's a model which entails the co-ownership and co-management through three distinct but mutually supporting groups. I'll call them groups or categories, let's say. The first would be a relevant state authority. A lot of the work that we've done and how we see this happens at a below national level. So we could be talking about a municipality here, but you could equally be talking about something that's an arm's length body. So it's not directly dealing with the local government, but it could be Transport for London, which we'll mention later, which isn't directly a government body in the way we're talking, but it's part of the public sphere. It's publicly owned assets that exist within this. So this is the public part of it. The second part is, which will easily or kind of summarize as the workers in here. And the third part, which would be something which is, we use this phrase, the catch-all phrase we use is a common association. Now, important to get from the beginning of when we have these three parts in, and I'll kind of come on to show you how they fit together in this model. But a commons association is its own legally constituted body. It's not just a group of people who are sort of concerned citizens who are part of this, but they belong and they participate in their own legally constituted body, which we'll call as a common association, and it tends to be bounded geographically, or we prefer to say territorially boundaried. So if we're imagining that we're talking about a pharmaceutical company that was based in Hull, let's say, it might be that the common association would be populated with people who fall within postcodes, let's say a series of postcodes that were close to where their manufacturing plant was, or you could tie it to political districts, or you could tie it to within a certain number of kilometers, or it could be people who've proved that they voted within a particular constituency, and so on. So the particular boundary is something which is contested depending on the asset, but the point is that there's very much a territory which belongs to the way that you think is who can be a member, who can join this common association and be a participant in it. So these are the three constituent parts of what forms a public common partnership. Next slide, please. So you can see in these three white circles, you've got those three different groupings, let's say, that I've talked about beforehand, and they get brought together as part of a joint enterprise. A joint enterprise is, in the simplest ways, it's a company we're talking about here. And in terms of the day-to-day operations, I'll keep running through with loosely saying a pharmaceutical company here, because we're not going to directly talk about that. In terms of its day-to-day operations, this joint enterprise would function in many ways similar to the way that a workers' cooperative might. So in terms of defining work processes, purchasing stock, and so on, the running of this as a kind of company. This comes down to questions of management, worker management process, which are critically important, but they're not they're contingent on the thing you're looking at, and they're not part of specifically what we're going to discuss today, or which we focus on in the book. But what's important is that these three, the workers, the public body, and the common association, are brought together in the collective governance of this joint enterprise. All of the assets are held within an asset lock. So we'd be talking about a pharmaceutical factory, the underlying land, the manufacturing equipment that was in it, for example, plus any money that it may own or anything. This is all held within an asset lock. The point of an asset lock, to clarify, is that it's very hard to asset strip something where the assets are held in an asset lock. They belong there. They can't be sold for profit. They can't be liquidated, is the easiest way to put it. And the board of this joint enterprise is the representatives from each three of these different partners of these different groups within this. We could get into the technicalities, but I think maybe we'll save them from a discussion about what sort of responsibilities are bounded. It's not that all of these board members are identical in terms of what they can do, but the point is that they end up being able to guide the ship of this particular company, let's say. And the common association plays a really important role within this, because alongside the workers and the public body, it also represents the capacity to shape the overall direction and what the social purpose of this organization is. So when we're talking about this language of contested reproduction, the idea you have different logics guiding how an organization might work, like compelling the decisions within that. The existence of the common association plays an additional role in introducing a form or contesting the logics by which this company works, right? So if you imagine on a very sort of simplistic level, you could imagine communities saying, well, look, we don't want gambling advertising plastered over all of the premises that are relevant to kind of this particular business. If this was let's say this was a local football stadium and a football ground, it might go against the direct economic interests of this football ground to remove all of its advertising from its shirts, could add up to millions of pounds, let's say. But the point is that the social parameters and the social interests of this might be something that the Common Association could intervene at board level and say, we need to change the way that this works. We need to change the parameters for this. So it introduces contests different types of logics that are at play in terms of how that joint enterprise actually gets governed. I'm not going to go into much more detail on this because we do intentionally keep this at quite an abstract level. But what I kind of want to emphasize here is that this is very, very much a micro scale that we're talking about. We're talking about individual assets, like one football ground or one factory here, which is quite far removed from this big question that we started with of transition, which is, how do we escape capitalism? How are we governing the way that our world works in a completely different fashion under communal logics? And it could seem like we're focusing at a scale which is far too small, or it doesn't connect to the scale of the challenge that we're needing to kind of address. But the point is, we're not putting forward public common partnerships here as if they're the desirable end goal. This isn't, kind of a slight difference to maybe quite a lot of the planning, economic planning literature. We're not suggesting that this is a model of a future society. What we're suggesting is this is something that you can start to do now, and that within the way that this functions, it has an impact not just on the people who are involved within this particular organization, but it has an effect on the broader changes of what can be done outside of this organization. So it has broader social and political effects. It changes the stakes of the game effectively. And that's why we talk about these not as sort of a beautiful little co-op or something like this, but rather as a cell form of transition. And that's what we're proposing here, is like, what are the cell forms of transition that are feasible to constitute within the context where we live, and the ones which we're trying to change and where we're working from. So there's one last bit of dynamic I want to pick up on this before I move into the next slide, where I'll kind of expand, being the right word, expand on this, which is this question of surplus. Because beyond the idea that these three sectors are involved in decision making within the joint enterprise, you have an inverse. You can see in our kind of little arrows in here, you can see a little arrow that says financial surplus, that's pointing from the joint enterprise to the common association. The simple way to imagine this is, let's say there's £300,000 at the end of a year from this pharmaceutical factory. That financial surplus doesn't remain within the joint enterprise. It gets transferred to the common association, which, if you remember, is an independent legal entity. It's territorially bounded, and it's made up of a membership. The people that are in there I'll come on to. Now, when these surpluses get transferred into the common association, they're responsible for then making decisions about how best to use this surplus to further their shared interests. This could be including not only the workers then, but you're including people from this territory, people who have been involved with repairing the streets, or who've been driving the public transport, or who've been performing childcare duties whilst all of the paid workers have gone into the factories and so on. So it recognises, in the sort of very first point of this, that the surplus that gets produced within this particular pharmaceutical factory, or wherever we're talking about, this is a social surplus. This social surplus hasn't been produced purely by the people who are working there. This social surplus, what's that? It's a surplus produced by society. And this transfer of wealth into the common association creates a mechanism for asking, how do we direct social surplus, and who gets a say in directing social surplus? So this is still at a very micro scale, but what we're talking about is a socialization of the investment function here. Where does the money come from, and who's involved with these processes, and what decisions can they participate in terms of socializing this investment function? So this is one part of it. And it's important as an addendum, maybe, because I do think we might come back to this. It's just to say, like, who are these people that are populating a common association? We can only really get into this, and we'll pick up on it a bit in the kind of the next section. But these shared interests don't exist. The people who are part of this, they're not preformed militant working class subjects, but people who invariably will have conflicting, although not necessarily contradictory, interests who are participants in it. Well, what does this mean in practice? It means that it's only through participating and agonistic deliberation over, well, what should we be doing this money? What is our common interest? What are we trying to invest in? It's only through this deliberation that you can actually understand and make sense of what a common interest is. And it's through doing this that you have a compositional effect. Compositional of what our shared class interests are in this process, but compositional of the class itself. It goes back to some of the points Kai made, which is it's through being involved that we start to learn how to govern, that we become a new people, that we recognize in ourselves and how differently we can act and what our competencies are in this way. So we very much see the compositional effect that can take place through this process of articulating class interest. It's one of the ways it happens. Okay, next slide, please. This image is self-explanatory. I think we could probably just go straight. Everyone can understand this one. So this is a way for us to try and get across then. What happens if you scale out? I say in the PCP is a micro scale, like zooming into this kind of micro politics or microeconomics of an individual PCP. What if you start to scale out and imagine what this investment function, this democratic investment function, looks like in practice. And we came up with something which we call it this distributed democratic control of surplus. In this image, each letter that you can see on there represents a PCP. So if you took all of those little interconnected bubbles that were in that last image and you compacted them into a single circle, that would be letter A, let's say. And each one of these numbers represents an investment cycle. So you can imagine that the surplus generated from A through deliberation results in another PCP, let's say. It's not in pharmaceuticals now, but it might be in a different part of the supply chain, for example. That's B. You get to a new investment cycle, and you can see, well, we've got two public common partnerships here. They're co-investing in C. Maybe that's a packaging research unit or something like this. So through this, the intention is to demonstrate that we're thinking not just about an individual, how do you better govern or liberate a particular organization in the name of the commons, but it's rather to establish a self-expansive dynamic. A self-expansive dynamic of the commons that to some extent can set us in the direction of countering the self-expansive dynamic of capital. I think there's one immediate sort of resistance to this, which might be it sounds like what we're proposing is that you can outcompete capitalism at its own growth game, something along these lines, that if only we generate and control more surplus, we can beat capital at its own game, which would be a big misreading of where, and in fact radically limiting what we think are the possibilities of this. And it comes back to this question of popular protagonism and how we see the different interconnecting ways that popular protagonism can be expressed. Because there are very real limits here in terms of the extent to which you're going to be able to generate the resources from these PCPs to bring new assets under forms of control, for example. But the way that we gain assets isn't only through buying them, and that's not how capital operates either. It's also through contesting them. So a mild version of this could look like common associations becoming quite important vehicles for articulating and fighting for a right to communal compulsory purchase, for example. So this is about changing the conditions of access to resources. It could look like they're moving on to support the direct contestation of specific assets. We can see lots of examples of this in kind of different places. In the book, we point to examples of the Unilever factory, for example, where very strong organisations led to the local state supporting the buyout of this factory and converting it into a workers' co-op. We can see the way they move on to support direct political contestation, kind of take yourself down to the ideas of what's been achieved with certain policy directions with Venezuela and what that means for kind of supporting of the communal processes there. And then finally, we've also got something which is closer to the defensive role here. And this pulls a little bit from some of the work of Eric Olin Wright. You don't have to go to Eric Olin Wright's work for this, but he has this useful phrase of a transition trough, which is if you do, Kai nodded to it, if you do have these revolutionary moments, points where you suddenly see a shock and you get capital flight or you get capital strikes in this, and you see huge inflationary pressures, people unable to buy commodities that they need to live and so on. You see this even if you have relatively mild social democratic governments attempt to get elected as well. So it's the ability to say, well, we've actually managed to contest and bring some parts of what's essential to our social reproduction under a different form of contested communal logic, the ability to sustain yourself and sustain the struggles that we need to be able to win. So hopefully these two slides taken together, you can see we're linking together the behaviors and the ways that we relate and connect together within very specific individual institutions into much larger transformative processes and the types of politics that can kind of irradiate from that as well. Next slide, please, Keir. So this is just to kind of finish on the bit that I'm saying, which is to say, everything that I've said so far, it remains abstract and it doesn't reflect the realities of organising on the ground in any particular places. It hasn't yet reflected what the kind of legal realities are. There's a lot of here saying form this organisation, form this thing, bring people together in this way. So it doesn't reflect any of those elements, and we don't really anticipate that what we're talking about here, an abstract level of the PCP, really will map on that directly to what these PCPs look like when you actually take them through the process of designing them and responding them to different sectors, different jurisdictions, and so on. And so our work has refined. We've kind of a back and forth between the versions of the PCP you've just seen now are actually, they've been refined and they've been changed based on us going and doing this work in a number of places, but there's sort of three of them that feature within the book, which is pharmaceuticals, which I drew a tiny, tiny bit on, work around food systems and food sovereignty, and this looks at how council farms could be a target or an appropriate place for this within the UK. And then a particular case of the Latin Village in London, which is a market that it's maybe Keir can say a little bit more, which helps to try and really bring this down from an abstract idea into actually like a very clear example of a concrete struggle of and why we're starting to talk about planning from below here.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Bert. Yeah, I'll just talk briefly about this. There's one example of a project we've been involved in, which is this one, the Latin Village or Ward's Corner market in North London. It's called the Latin Village colloquially because it's the centre of the Latin American community in London. It's the only centre actually now, because a similar market in Elephant and Castle got developed out of existence a couple of years ago. So this building in Tottenham, quite a long time ago, I think it's probably something like 23 years ago, it got earmarked for a gentrification development, a classic development you would find in a large city, which is it would knock down this building and turn it into luxury apartments and a market made of chain stores that you would find anywhere else. The market traders started a campaign. They drew in local anti-gentrification campaigners, etc., etc., and they struggled for around 12 years to defeat these gentrification plans. Then in 2017, they launched a community plan for the alternative development of the site. The Ward's Corner community plan proposes a community-led, community-owned refurbishment of the market and the wider building, the Ward's Corner building, which is why it's called the Ward's Corner market, to create a new market, a cultural hub, a social hub, some housing units, etc., etc. They struggled in the way that anti-gentrification campaigns struggle. They held demonstrations. They lobbied politicians. They drew up petitions, etc. They even lobbied the UN and got the UN to make an intervention in their favour. And then in 2021, the campaign won a huge victory. Actually, the developer for the gentrification development, Granger PLC, withdrew their proposals to demolish Ward's Corner and to develop it in the way that they were planning to. And then, shortly afterwards, both the local council and Transport for London, who own the building, we'll get into why they own the building in a minute. Basically they said, well, look, we need they committed to a community-led future for the building, basically. Just around the same time as that, we, as Abundance, got asked in to contribute to the community plan to outline how this could be a public common partnership for the site. This is one model in which a public common partnership can emerge, one of the ways it can emerge, because it's quite a common thing, actually. If you have a anti-gentrification campaign at a certain point, you're going to need an alternative plan for that site. Otherwise, it just becomes, an ongoing problem for whoever owns the site, and also for the local authority who will be deciding on planning permission, etc., etc. And this also illustrates, I think, when Bert showed that the self-expansion of the commons diagram, the diagram where one PCP, the knowledge and resources from one PCP may go to found another one. What we're talking about also is that we're founding new sites of struggle. This is what we showed you earlier was a sort of technical element to politics, but politics, there is a technical element to politics, but like politics is driven by political struggle, and that's what we're expanding as well as the commons. So we were invited in to draw up to think about a public common partnership for the site. And so this is a financial flow and governance diagram for a public common partnership at Ward's Corner. You'll notice that the abstract tripartite structure that Bertie showed earlier has turned into something that's slightly more more complicated. The joint enterprise is this: it's Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society. Community Benefit Society is a legal form in the UK. You have to define what the community is. You have to define what the benefit is. But that's the purpose of a community benefit society. The public here, as Bert mentioned earlier, is represented by Transport for London. They own the building. They own the building because the tube line runs very close underneath. Their main interest actually is to ensure that there's no infrastructural work done on the building, which will cause it to collapse onto the tube line below. So the Transport for London are something we'd probably say they're a quasi-public body. The workers in this case would be the Seven Sisters Market Tenants Association, an existing organisation, the market traders. They would stand in for the workers in this case. You might be able to see here, there's a little blue diagram, a little blue arrow coming off the Seven Sisters Market Tenants Association, which indicates that they're the ones who employ the market manager. They're the ones who determine how the market is run. They've had a lot of trouble over the years of having market managers imposed on them, etc., etc. But they would feed into the governance of the Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society. The most interesting organisation for us is the West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust. This is what will represents the Common Association in this case. And you can see there surplus after operating costs going to the West Green Road Seven Sisters Community Development Trust. In our plans for this, Transport for London, their role would be able to feed in, but community benefit societies allow you to have different types of membership, which have different types of rights and responsibilities, and you can delimit the amount of decision-making power that particular entities get. So Transport for London's interest is primarily in infrastructural work. They could be given a veto over that. That wouldn't be a problem. In our plans, they would also use, Transport for London would use their ownership of many other assets around London to underwrite some of the loans that may be necessary to establish Ward's Corner Community Benefit Society and to revamp the building, etc. So that would be a case of the public de-risking common ownership. If the most obvious example, the most obvious definition of what a public common partnership is to it's an institutional form aiming to reverse the effects of public-private partnerships in which the public de-risks private ownership. Part of the public common partnership argument is, we need to make political arguments and political campaigning to say that that's not right. In fact, we should de-risk common ownership. The public should facilitate common ownership and governance projects. So the Seven Sisters, West Green Road Seven Sisters Development Trust, they would be receiving some of the surplus after operating costs. There's been it is an actually existing organisation. There's been campaigns, or a community organisers being employed whose role is to go and organise door knocking to try to build that out into a mass membership organisation. There's been some workshops done with the local community about if this the market produced a surplus, and there was some financial modelling which showed that after 3 years the market and the housing etc could produce something like £2.3 million worth of surplus. So the exercises were done. If there was a surplus of say £1 million in the local area, what would you want to do with that? One of the things that came up was a community nursery, but like the whole exercise, of like the local community joining the development trust and drawing up plans for how they would like their local area to develop. That we see as incredibly key political moment, because all of a sudden you're giving the local community democratic control over what they would like to see in that local area. They will have to discuss, they will have to negotiate and work out what they prioritize most. That is what they value most. It is the production of common values, the prioritization of activity, etc., and the drawing up of alternative plans for the local area. All of a sudden, the local community are in the position when they negotiate with the local authority, for instance, that the big developers find themselves in. They own an asset and they're doing some sort of participatory budgeting on the surpluses that come from those assets. one thing, the last thing I'd say about this is let's just have a little think about the class compositional effects that this could have. The Seven Sisters Market Tenants Association is drawn up by the market traders. Quite often they're sole traders or family businesses, etc. They are, as you might put it, the petty bourgeoisie, a classically politically ambiguous class category. You know, quite often the source for right-wing projects and fascism, etc. Why is that? Well, because petty bourgeois and particularly sole traders and small, very, very small businesses, you know, they're in a very precarious position. They are dependent on making profit, but like basically usually just enough profit to survive rather than to expand. But they're in a very precarious position in the face of big capital as well. They face the world as individuals or as families, and they face the world through the logic of private property. All of a sudden, if they're enrolled in this project, in a project like this, they are enrolled in a project which induces them to see the world through the logic of collective property. It adds a moment of collectivity into a class structure which is quite individualizing. So in that sort of way, we can think about this sort of public common partnership as an intervention into as a moment of class recomposition. We'd even put it that way. Okay, I mean that's what I would wanted to say about the Wards Corner Latin Village public common partnership. So far, we've gone through from we started off and we've talked about the theory of transition. We've talked about public common partnerships in the abstract. Then we talked about public common partnerships, or at least one example of public common partnerships in practice, or how we try to put them into practice. We could also talk about, well, I'm not going to now, but we could talk about some of the other projects we've been involved in, which lead us much more logically to think about how public common partnerships might network together, but then they may get to a stage where they need a level of coordination and planning, a level above the local, if you know what I mean. So one of the ways we thought through this idea of urban development, where you're basically trying to build up a density of common ownership projects in a local area. So that's one of the ways in which we develop the capacities and knowledge that can then be applied on a wider scale. I mean, one of the neoliberalism did this. They tried to work out how things were going to work by organizing special economic zones. They worked out the institutional forms and the practices that were needed and the arguments that work, and then they applied them more generally. You can sort of think about urban development plans and this building of a density of common ownership projects in that sort of way. Other projects lead you much more directly to think about planning on a sectoral scale, when we talked about pharmaceutical production, for instance, or on a larger than local scale, when we talk about food systems and the use of what we call council farms, council-owned farms, in order to think through the planning of food systems on a regional level. We could get into those in the questions, or we could take the discussion any which way you'd like. Shall I hand back to you, Eric, to handle the discussion?
Yes, thanks a lot. I will end the recording here.